You know, I don't believe in reparations, but I realized the moment that my ancestors would show me what I did it, that we're the most foundational ones.
Right. Good evening, everyone. Before we get started, I want to let you know that this lecture is being recorded and will be available on the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum YouTube channel and website after this presentation. My name is Natalia Mercedes Rodriguez, and I am the Digital Content and Programs Coordinator at Dyckman Farmhouse Museum. I want to thank you all so much for joining us for the first Back Porch History Lecture of 2026. Each summer, Dyckman Farmhouse Museum Alliance invites 3 local historians to share their notable research on Northern Manhattan and NYC history as part of a free in-person lecture series, Back Porch History. Today, I am honored to be introducing the first Back Porch History speaker of 2026, Lavada Nahon. Right, was that correct? Okay. Lavada Nahon is the interpreter of African American history for the Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation, Bureau of Historic Sites, a position which she has held since the inception in 2019. With nearly 30 years of public history experience, she focuses on New Netherland and New York 17th through 19th centuries, specifically the lives and cultures of Africans and their descendants, enslaved and free. As a culinary and cultural historian, she has worked for a wide variety of historic sites and organizations around the tri-state region. Her mission is to bring history to life by giving presence to the Africans and people of African descent enslaved and free in New Netherland and New York in whatever way possible. Today, Lavada Nahon will be presenting Reclaiming Pinkster, an hour-long lecture exploring the origins of the oldest African celebration in the nation and its indelible connection to New York's Black history. For those who may not know, Pinkster was a time where enslaved and free Africans gathered around the colony and state to rest, renew family and friendship ties, and reconnect to European faith that had been transformed in West Central Africa. In Reclaiming Pinkster, Nahon will examine how celebrating Pinkster in the past expanded the humanity of the enslaved and how celebrating it today continues to honor the lives of their descendants. During the lecture, if you have any questions for the speaker, please hold your questions until the Q&A session after the lecture. I also want to take a moment to sincerely thank our sponsors of this lecture series, the Cows Charitable Trust, the New York State Council on the Arts with the support of the Office of the Governor and the New York State Legislature, and the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council. Now, after that mouthful, without further ado, join me in welcoming Lavada Nahon.
Good evening, everyone, and thanks for coming out. I want to thank you for being here. I want to thank my colleagues at Dyckman Farmhouse for giving me this opportunity. And we're going to just have a short chat and see if we can take a look at Pinkster. Reclaiming aligns with the concept of Sankofa. Sankofa is a word and a symbol from the Akan tribe in Ghana, West Africa. There are 2 symbols that represent Sankofa. One is a mythical bird with its feet firmly planted. There you go. Yep, great, thanks. Its feet firmly planted forward and its head turned backwards, often with an egg it has retrieved in or near its beak. The egg represents the wisdom from the past that we are reclaiming, that we are bringing forward. The Akan believe that past serves as a guide for planning the future, helping us to create a stronger one. They also believe that there must be movement and new learning as time passes. As forward march proceeds, the knowledge of the past must never be forgotten. For years, New York early Black history has been all but forgotten. In the structuring of a unified American history, it was decided by folks long ago that the colonial period would focus on the British and that slavery would be attached to the period of the cotton plantations of the South. This was easy to do. After all was said and done, there were 13 colonies, but the colonizing of North America didn't begin that way. New York was originally part of the larger landmass of New Netherland, owned by the Dutch West India Company, whose records were in Dutch. Having everyone in the English period just made things less complicated. Over the years, some New Yorkers did learn about New Netherland in school, and others did not. It went in and out of the school curriculum. By reclaiming Pinkster, we open a gateway into the 200 years of enslavement in the state's past, which began with the arrival of 22 African men and women on August 29th, 1627. Just 3 years after the initial settlement of the colony, 1 year after building the capital city of New Amsterdam, which we now call New York City. It puts the Africans back where they belong, in the beginning of the story, and opens up the way for us to understand their pivotal role in the development of our state and nation. But more so, it helps us see beyond the chains and the wretchedness of the bottom of the boats, beyond the initial trauma, and restores the full humanity. Because, as our colleagues in Kingston have declared, joy is an act of resistance. So, what is Pinkster? Pinkster is the oldest documented religious and cultural celebration performed by Africans in the Americas. Pinkster is the shortened version of the Dutch word Pinkersten, the Dutch word for the Christian feast of Pentecost. Today, many people, Christian or not, are aware of Easter or Easter Sunday. Few people know Easter as a season of the Christian church, which commemorates the story of the resurrected Christ living on earth. Fewer are still aware or celebrate Pinkster any longer, which falls 50 days after Easter. It is the last day the resurrected Christ is on earth. Pentecost marks the beginning of the Christian church and is the second major feast of the Christian church, with Easter being the first. Pentecost has several names. A familiar one to many may be Whit Sunday. Pinkster falls at the end of May or the beginning of June, depending on Easter. This year, Pinkster Sunday is this coming Sunday, May 24th. Historically, in our region, Pinkster happens at a time when the ground was still not quite ready for most vegetables to go in. Today, with global warming affecting us so heavily, we forget that our country's beginnings took place at the end of the Little Ice Age, when it was colder and the earth took longer to warm up during the spring. Because it tended to be colder at Easter, Pinkster was more than just church on Sunday. It was a time when the variety of Northern Europeans who lived here, particularly the Dutch, traveled, visited with family and friends, enjoyed games, fairs, and other areas of recreation. It falls at a time when Europeans, again, particularly the Dutch, accustomed to taking time off before stepping into the full planting and caring for crops that would happen by mid-June. It gives people a chance to go outside in nice weather, enjoying it just as we do. When the Dutch, English, and other Northern Europeans were off visiting their families, they gave their enslaved time off as well, unless, of course, they were the host family, where guests would be coming, so the enslaved continued their labor. 20% of the enslaved population lived in New York City. However, 80% lived in rural areas on large estates known as manors or patents or farms, and they even lived on small farms. Many of the enslaved in New York worked alone or only with one of two others. Yes, there were places with more, but that's the average. Unlike the South, where you have a few people who own a large number of slaves, here in our area, a lot of people were enslavers, not just the elite class. Our largest numbers of enslavers were actually tenant farmers, people who rented their land. Enslaved Africans could be found throughout all levels of society and throughout all of the colonized lands here in New York where enslaved lived. They could also be found among the indigenous. In 1692, a law was passed that made it illegal for enslaved people to make noise on Sundays. While Pinkster Sunday was reserved for church services and quiet living, Monday was another day. At the height of the Pinkster as an African celebration, the enslaved had anywhere from 3 to 5 days off. This allowed them to travel to larger urban areas or to rest and celebrate where they were or on a nearby farm. There were several things that helped Pinkster become known as an African celebration. First was the fact that the gatherings were held in public spaces, open fields, and in markets in New York City. Unlike their enslavers, those held in bondage did not have their own homes or estates where they could invite guests. Many of these locations were used year after year, and people knew where to go. Thomas DeVoe's The Market Book, A History of Public Markets in New York City, published in 1862, drew on memories of the earlier period with firsthand experiences. Lists the Buttermilk Market and Catherine's Market as two locations for Pinkster within New York City. These open spaces allowed for their enslavers, visitors, and the native population to join in or look at what they were doing. This resulted in Pinkster being mentioned in newspapers, letters, stories, and other ephemera. James Fenimore Cooper's book, Satan's Toe, published in 1845, uses Pinkster as the background for the story. Throughout the book, he gives great descriptions of what was happening and who was there. For instance, he begins by setting the location for the event for us. Quote, before separating, however, we agreed to meet next morning in the fields at the head of Broadway on the Common, which, as it was understood, was to be the scene of the Pinkster sport, quote, close. A few pages later, he says, quote, the next day was the first of the 3 that are devoted to Pinkster, the great Saturnalia of the New York Blacks. Although this festival is always kept with more vivacity at Albany than in New York, it is far from being neglected, even now in the later place, quote, closed. Cooper's work and others mention that African elements, the things that set Pinkster apart from other European gatherings. Quote, the features that distinguish a Pinkster frolic from the usual scenes at fairs and other merrymaking, however, were of African origin. It is true, there are not now, nor were they then, many Blacks among us of African birth. Current research corrects that, just so you know. But the traditions and usages of the original country were so far preserved as to produce a marked difference between this festival and one of European origin. Among other things, some were making music by beating on skins drawn over the ends of logs, hollow logs, while others were dancing to it in a manner to show that they felt infinite delight. This in particular was said to be a usage of their African progenitors. Pinkster did not begin as a large celebration with hundreds of people. It began small, I believe, as part of the regular worship practices of those first enslaved in New Netherland. Christianity officially entered West Central Africa through the Kingdom of Congo in 1491, following the arrival of the first Portuguese explorers and Roman Catholic missionaries into that area, a year before Columbus discovered America, long before the transatlantic slave trade really got going. Less than a year after the Portuguese arrival, the King of Congo converted to Christianity, and his son made Christianity the state religion during his reign. The kingdom had a long and fruitful relationship with Portugal and the Roman Catholic Church until the demands of the Portuguese and the Spanish for more slaves because of their New World discoveries shifted the relationship. The kingdom's people did not completely replace the indigenous religion with Christianity. They adapted it and blended the two, creating a Congolese rite, a variation of Christianity, where you will also see in other parts of the world, an African version of the faith. In 2023, we learned, thanks to the work of Dr. Jaap Jacobs, that the first enslaved Africans arrived in New Amsterdam, the capital city of the Dutch colony of New Netherland, on August 29, 1627. He wrote of the people beginning their journey from São Tomé, an island on the West Central African coast. His research and paper touched on the work of another New Netherlands scholar, Dr. Jerome de Wolf, whose work looks at the Spanish and the spreading of Catholicism in Africa and its movement over to the New World, and other topics related to the Dutch and New Netherlands. He announced 2 years ago at the Slavery in New Netherlands and the Dutch Atlantic World Conference that he had been tracking ships to see if he could locate the vessel the Dutch had taken the enslaved from. In November of 2025, just 6 months ago, he published his findings in the Colonial Latin American Review. His paper, The Captives of the Brunswick, 1627, New Insights into the Origins and Ladino Identities of Manhattan's First Enslaved Africans, took him into Spanish archives for the research. As he writes in the abstract, heretofore unexplored documents from the Archivo General de Indias, his exploration resulted in a paper that speaks to men and women taken from the island of São Tomé on the West African coast who had been enslaved there from Angola, a nation which the Congolese had been invading for years. As the Kingdom of Congo expanded, and as the Spanish and Portuguese took people from the region, Christianity, particularly Catholicism, traveled with them. Sao Tome was controlled by the Spanish, who were very Catholic. And as the cultures mixed, Catholicism grew, and the Africans, particularly those of mixed heritage, actively participated. The research strongly suggests that some of the initial 22 were practicing Catholics and had taken European names, either given at birth or taken at baptism, along with other customs. When we look at the list of names of enslaved that petitioned for freedom and received half freedom, it was noted that they were among some of the earliest enslaved by the company. We see names reflecting the European: Peter Santome, Paulo de Angola, Ana de Angola, Anthony Portuguese, and others. Since there was no Catholic church in New Netherlands, historic records show they worshiped in the only Christian church available, the Dutch Reformed Church, a practice that would continue with enslaved and free throughout the period of slavery in New York. They married, baptized their children, stood in as godparents to each other's offsprings, and left a trail of their presence in church records and court and council papers. Church records throughout the lower state region still bear witness to the presence of enslaved and free Blacks engaging with the Dutch Reformed Church. Over the 200 years of slavery, more people were imported from Angola and Congo. Many of them spent time on Spanish or Portuguese-held islands in the Caribbean and West Indies, as well as in Brazil. They brought their faith with them to New York, not just Christianity, but also the indigenous practices of the Congo and West Africa, all of which can be found in the archaeological records from Long Island all the way up the Upper Hudson River Valley and the Mohawk River Valleys. Over time, Pinkster celebrations grew. Many historians suggest that the practice of giving the enslaved time off to celebrate Pinkster, a time when the weather was fine and travel was possible, lessened their stress and aggression. But what we do know is that the historic record shows that it allowed them to travel without passes, to see their family and friends, and others like themselves, and to reclaim their own full humanity, and to maintain their cultural practices, playing drums, dancing, gaming, wrestling, visiting, laughing, and being fully human, even as their enslavers watched often from the sidelines. Current research is also deepening the links of Pinkster to similar celebrations in other diaspora locations throughout the Caribbean, West Indies, and even into Louisiana. The largest Pinkster celebrations were held in Albany, particularly those from the 1780s to 1810. Albany was home to a large population of enslaved, but it was surrounded by other cities with large populations like Troy, Schenectady, and Saratoga. All of these areas were surrounded by large wheat farms where enslaved men and women toiled and had for 200 years. By the time the Albany Common Council banned Pinkster in 1811, thousands of people were gathering on Pinkster Hill. Newspaper accounts speak to the ban being caused by the concern of the huge and growing crowds, the drunkenness, and the worry with more and more enslaved being manumitted or freed that things would get worse. But the historic record also shows that 1 year later, In 1812, New York's first state capitol was being constructed on Pinkster Hill, which offered a beautiful view of the Hudson River lying at its feet. It is the same location as the current Capitol building, a place with documented history related to New York enslavement of Africans and their descendants. Yet, with all the historic markers around it, Pinkster is not mentioned. The reclaiming of Pinkster from the African perspective began nearly 40 years ago at Phillipsburg Manor, Upper Mills, in Sleepy Hollow. A Dutch-focused Pinkster had been part of the public programming, but the entire site's story shifted from the originally presented narrative centered on the family that never mentioned them as enslavers or slave traders to one that centered on what the historic documents actually said. The Phillips family did not live there day to day, primarily a home for their enslaved farm and mill workers, one hub in their large 50,000-acre estate that home to hundreds of other enslaved on the tenant farms the manor had been broken into. The Upper Mills is one of two houses that stood on the manor of, or still stand, on the manor of Phillipsburg, which were originally owned by Frederick Phillips, the wealthiest man in the colony when the British took over in 1664. He said himself, he made the most of his money in the Negroes. Not just an enslaver, he was an active slave trader. And it is to him, his sons, and the pirates they worked with that New York's enslaved population also include a large number of people from the east side of Africa, the island of Madagascar. The reclaiming of Pinkster started as research in the New Netherland period was growing. The State Archive had hired Dr. Charles Gehring to translate Dutch West India Company documents into English. Work on New Netherlands history had begun in the Netherlands, and that's when they discovered that half the paper had been thrown away or sold as scrap. And research into the material that had been gathered by a historian hired by John D. Rockefeller when he first purchased Phillips Manor Hall had been began to be explored. All of this work supported scholarship, not just focused on Pinkster celebrations, but on the daily lives of the enslaved at other sites in the Hudson River Valley, New York City, and Brooklyn. Historic Hudson Valley stores two sites, the Upper Mills and Van Cortlandt Manor in Croton-on-Hudson, where enslavement was again linked to a major elite founding family and the work in this area. It also helped that one of the primary performers and organizers of the initial Pinkster events at the Upper Mills was Pearl Primus, an American dancer, choreographer, anthropologist, and teacher. Primus played an important role in the presentation of African dance to American audiences. Early in her career, she saw the need to promote African dance as an art form worth of study and performance. Primus's work was a reaction to the myths of savagery and the lack of knowledge about African people. It was an effort to guide the Western world to view African dance as an important and dignified statement about another way of life. The second generation of performers at Phillipsburg's Pinkster grew from the troupe Primus had established. The Pinkster players a popular reenactment group focused on Pinkster and led by Chief Baba Neil Clark, includes members from the second generation troop. It took years for the scholarship and efforts to build the story of enslavement in New York and to move towards it being commonly spoken of at historic sites and locations across the state. During these years, Pinkster remained locked at the Upper Mills. It was deemed their event. For me, the studying of medieval Africa and the early years of the relationship between the Kingdom of Congo and Europe was part of a larger scope of interest, which I began in high school. By the time Jerome de Wolf published The Pinkster King and the King of Congo, my understanding of the path had already been introduced. But for many of my colleagues in New York, the work of bringing the history of enslavement into play has been more recent. But it was the publishing of that book that helped everyone to see Pinkster belongs to all, not just historic Hudson Valley. Over the last 5 to 7 years, Pinkster has been celebrated from the African perspective in multiple locations around New York. And like it was during the long historic period, it is different at each location. Adding Pinkster to the regular seasonal programming, coupled with openly speaking to the presence of the enslaved and free Blacks in New York's early history, has taken them from being just working chattel to full human beings. It has opened up dialogues, and it has shifted how enslaved Africans and their descendants were and are viewed. It has helped them to be seen. No longer does New York's story begin with the Underground Railroad and Southern freedom seekers. Reclaiming Pinkster has allowed us to push against words like slaves, which strip the Africans and their descendants of their agency. Instead, it has helped us to embrace the reality that they did push back and clearly see the calculated effort used to control thousands of people. It helped us to re-examine the letters of the enslavers and see the pushback and comments of when they spoke of broken mills, escaped slaves, and other form of subtle and not so subtle resistance. But for me, more importantly, it has helped me to see that they had joy in their lives, that they loved, they laughed, and they reveled in being Africans that they were. The Pinkster celebrations were organized by the enslaved and free for themselves. They all took place during the same period of time, but each one had a similar but different flavor. The later, larger gatherings took time and money to put on. Even the smaller ones had to have a bit of preparation. A newspaper clip from an Albany paper quote the enslaved from Schuyler Flats near Saratoga, saying they didn't always go to Albany because they were too tired to row against the tide. So they celebrated and they rested, taking their time off in the place where they lived. Recently, our colleague Ian Mupton at Johnson Hall up on the Mohawk River, in researching the enslaved butler, Mr. Franks, discovered that he had purchased a cask of rum a week before Pinkster, probably to be enjoyed by the 25 or 30 people on the Johnson Hall estate. The enslaved cherished Pinkster. They worked hard to have these special occasions happen, and it was not until the 1830s, with the abolition of slavery ended and the Black community saw those that they loved regularly, did things begin to change. During the period of transition out of slavery and into freedom, the Black community openly debated what it would take for whites to see them as equal citizens. They debated how African they could be and still be accepted enough to be able to vote and participate in civil society. They discussed whether they should parade any longer or not. They discussed what to call themselves, colored, Negro, or Black. Africa or African found its way in the title of churches or organizations, but more and more, it was not how they saw themselves or what they called themselves. The growing colonization movement that grew with abolition across the state and nation and had various schemes to move the newly freed back to Africa, had them digging in their heels and saying, no, the United States is our country. They had been born here, slaved here, and were staying here. And making those choices, they embraced moral uplift. That means they were imitating of the white dominant culture, laying the foundation for Black American culture. They were encouraged by groups like the New York Manumission Society to embrace temperance and to stop doing anything that would bring attention to themselves. This meant no open public displays that would be deemed unsavory. Improving their lot meant building their own churches, lodges, and meeting halls so they no longer had to do anything in public view unless they wanted to. With the growing number of Irish immigrants and increased racial tensions, it was their decision to be more American than African that caused the links to the Africanness to begin to fade. Pinkster was replaced with local, state, and national civic celebrations like election days and the 4th of July. Within the last 20 years, research on the institution of slavery and those enslaved in New Netherlands and New York has taken a giant leap. Our unique state story is no longer completely shadowed by Southern plantation slavery. And Pinkster and our own Abolition Day, the second Monday in July, should not continue to be overshadowed by Juneteenth. But it has a long way to go before Pinkster is common knowledge. The interdisciplinary work that supports the reclaiming and the spreading of Pinkster is ongoing. And today, we face a more nuanced problem. How do we separate Pinkster from any other Afrocentric event, perhaps without the period clothes and the historic pageantry that is in the documented historic record? In community, the historic world of early New York history has chosen to celebrate Pinkster during the religious season in which Pentecost falls, and as it was, and as it should be. No matter what the Pinkster you attend looks like, we share the history of Pinkster in a way that people can continue to explore long after they have gone. Through signage, handouts, and other material, we hope to expand awareness and encourage everyone to read up on Pinkster from historic documents to a recently posted blog. We speak of it throughout the year, and we are still getting more buy-in from historic sites to celebrate Pinkster, even when somebody else nearby may be doing so as well. As we approach 2027 and two monumental New York Black History anniversaries, the 200th anniversary of the abolition or legal end of slavery on July 4th and 5th, mainly on the 5th, as the Black community chose to do in 1827, and August the 29th, the 400th anniversary of the arrival of the first 22 African men and women in New Netherlands, Pinkster will be part of the year. And moving forward, strengthening every year as we reclaim not just the day or the event, but the significance of the Africans and their descendants maintaining their Africanness in our state's history. Thank you. So I guess we're up to that Q&A.
So for the author, I forgot his name exactly. Did he
Would-
mention, oh. For the author, I forgot his name exactly. Did he mention double dutch? So I heard you mention wrestling, dancing, visiting, but was double dutch mentioned?
We actually have very little, I have not, no, let me correct that. I have not, in any of my research to date, seen any reference to jumping rope or double dutch. Now, could they have been doing it? Yes. Why? We are a major seaport, and not just as New York City, but all up the Hudson and into the Mohawk Valley. The rope is readily available. Could kids have been playing with rope? Yes, we don't know. But one place to start looking, if you're looking particularly at historic games that we can document, in many of the houses, I will say, I know at Van Cortlandt Manor in Croton, at the tenant farmhouse, at Phillipsburg, Phillips Manor Hall in Yonkers. And I want to say at one of the houses at historic Huguenot Street. All of these Dutch houses have, almost every Dutch house in New York has some form of Delft tiles. A number of those tile patterns are children playing games. I know I've seen balls. I know I've seen hoops and sticks. I have a vague memory of someone with a rope that could have been a jump rope, but I honestly can't tell you which of the houses I saw that in.
Okay.
But in that connection, I would say we don't have any African references for it. But the commonality of children playing with rope, particularly from countries where rope was just readily available, that's where I would start. And the most dominant reference to that we have would be the game focus Delft tiles. There's also a painting. I'll give you my card. My colleagues I work at the resource center for the Parks Department, and my colleagues are really into puzzles. And they just completed a puzzle of a Dutch painting. And it's very big, and the figures are really small, but it's kids playing games. It's kids, like, I don't know, it may have been a festival or something, but almost the entire painting, you see kids playing different kinds of games. You may see it in there. But I would tend to, because even there is a sketch. No, there is I never pronounced this right, daguerreotype. Yeah. Of and I can't even tell you where it's on the cover. It's on the cover of Leslie Harris's book, where you have all of these little Black girls and their white pinafores, but they have hoops and sticks. So that's where I would start that search. I don't, I would tend to, for me, don't, because I really haven't looked at this. Jumping rope for me, I think comes out of the period of transition. So I would say, see if you can find early references of people jumping ropes, but I would honestly start looking past 1827 because children worked. Children were given away as young as 3 years old to another person. So kids don't really have a lot of time to play. I mean, when we think of the enslaved, you have to remember they are immediately trained as early as possible to work. And kids can do a lot. You know, it's when you think in terms of like a kitchen garden and how much weeding has to be done, berry picking, they're used as chimney sweeps a lot. They're doing small things, nimble things. Girls are learning to do beautiful needlework by the time they're 5. So during the period of enslavement, I just don't really see them playing very much. Now, in activities like Pinkster, maybe running around and stuff, but also because of the way the enslaved were held, they would have to be playing, you know, you're playing jump rope with somebody else. You know, there's 2 people holding the rope and then somebody actually doing the jumping. And almost all of the European games, jumping rope is too much physical activity for a girl. So you see the like game of graces. Are you familiar with that? It's a small hoop and it's 2 sticks and they're kind of like throwing it to each other. But you know, you're flinging. You ain't running, right? You see girls with hoops. But even at that, it is about you're only running as much as you need to hit the hoop to get it to continue to roll. So you're not like, you don't sweat, you know, that's not very ladylike. But in terms of the Black girls, I honestly don't think that they have time to play like that. But when you get into the period of what we call the rising generation, right? The rising generation are children born after the 1799 Gradual Act of Abolition. That act says that any child born to an enslaved woman is born free, but they're bound to their mother's enslaver. So they become reclassified as indentured servants. So that's why we say, you know, that is one of the reasons I seriously push back when people talk about New York emancipation, right? Because emancipate, each of the words that we use, abolition, manumission, emancipation, are legal terms. So manumission means that you are freeing an enslaved person that you own. Like I would free my own enslaved. While slavery is still the law of the land. Emancipation means that a government is freeing somebody else's enslaved, while slavery is still the law of the land. That's why, you know, a lot of people think the Emancipation Proclamation ended slavery. It did not. Slaves were still in New Jersey and in Delaware and in Maryland. Slavery doesn't end until the passing of the 13th Amendment. Abolition is the legal end of the law of slavery, but it does not require everyone enslaved to be freed. So that's why the born free children, that's why we would say, well, there was no slavery in New York after 1827. Yes and no. They weren't called slaves. They were called indentured servants, but they did not have a contract. They were legally bound to their mothers and slavers. The first time it was men at 28 and women at 25, they could be freed. In the 1870 Act for Servants and Slaves, they changed that to everyone born free would be freed at 1821. Current research shows that the last person may have died, may have been freed in 1841, 42. There was a woman that they researched in Dutchess County, I believe, that they don't think she was ever freed. There's also a man in Bethlehem, they also believe was never freed. So it's a play, because the bottom line is they could not anticipate the arrival of the Irish, right? So you have a solid labor force for 200 years, right? That everyone has just become accustomed to. That's what John Jay says, we're just become accustomed, right? They know it has to change, but how do you replace this labor? And we have to remember, this is also the time that we're still recovering from the Revolutionary War. We're still dealing with a total economic shift of the lower half of the state. So the Erie Canal opens up and things change, but it takes a minute. So I still don't see kids really playing, a lot until we get on the other side of 1827. So I would start looking to see if you can find rope games in the Dutch period. But then I would say, really start looking for places to trace them actually doing it post 1827.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yes, sir.
Could you talk about what was the Pinkster King? What you just
So the Pinkster King, at the larger Pinkster celebrations, they are actually set up like a African village. The description of the ones in Albany show that the people who are attending Pinkster will arrive on the first day, and they set everything up. There's a platform for the king and his entourage and all of that. So the king is the most famous of the kings is King Charlie in Albany, and he is elected by the people. Historic reference says that he was probably of royal blood coming out of Congo, or Angola. I think it's Congo. And he acted as a representative for the community. But he was also the master drummer.
Oh.
Okay. So the master drummer in African culture is a religious place, right? We think of African drums as entertainment, right? They're just, making music. The first purpose of the drums are to communicate with the divine. So the master drummer is like a priest. And there are all of these different rhythms. Like we talk about the jellies and the griots, they learn the stories. The master drummers learn all of the different beats and rhythms for the various ceremonies and all of that. It's not just how do we communicate with the next village, right? But we hear, when they're playing different rhythms. And I have only once experienced a master drummer, actually Chief Bob and Neil Clark, playing oh my God, it was for the funeral of Randy Weston. And as the casket was coming in, the rhythm he played was so earth and ancient. It was amazing. So that's what King Charlie is, because the drums will call down the Orisha. The drums will call in the ancestors. And the gifts of the master drummer is to see that transition happening, right? Because then they can change the rhythms and get that to stop, or they can continue to call them down. And this is both in West African and West Central African tradition. So he is that man. He is that leader. He is the step below what would really be the king. And a lot of people don't realize that in African West Central Africa is very urbanized and royalty is common, right? It is most of these places are monarchies. The chiefs are, the representatives, the mayors, the big man. When you're not a chief, I mean, there is that whole ritual, royal protocol, and they still are today. I mean, you have a lot of African royals. There's actually a woman from Philadelphia named Queen Peggy, a small village in the Nigeria area. So he is that representative. And he actually starts it as a young man. He starts it as the master drummer. And historic record shows him aging out. He turns over the drumming. There's another drummer in New York who is a master drummer, although he is sometimes called a king here, but not often. The last name is Quackenbush. But there are different ones, but King Charlie tends to be the most century. So he controls the first day people are setting up, right, and getting everything up. The king and the entourage come in the second day. And that is the day really of the big celebrations, the dancings, the offerings, and all of that. And he is the master ceremony. He is the one who is controlling all of that. And then he will open the ceremony and he will close the ceremony. And then he will remain the representative for the people, the enslaved, for Albany during that time. Did that answer your question?
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you so much. I'm Francesca. I'm from Panama, a very small country in Central America. So when you were talking, I keep thinking, because I'm always thinking, in which ways we we can connect. And your question about the king, the Pinkster king, brought me back to Carnival in Latin America. It's like the whole Pinkster thing was like, to me, was like, okay, so in Panama, in a lot of Caribbean, I like people to think that Panama is Caribbean.
Yes.
We like Carnival is like the world stops. Like we don't care. Like those are the 4 days we have to just be ourselves and our true self and happy and celebrate and drink and do. And I wanted to ask you if you know by any chance if there's like a kind of like parallelism between King Momo, which is the king of Carnival, and Pinkster.
Yes, and that's where the research is going. That's what is coming up. So Carnival actually happens before Lent starts, right? So there is this whole deal of getting ready, right? Get your stuff out. Get your stuff out, have a good time, party, because you got 40 days of fasting. Then it comes up a little bit more around Easter. We have now made Easter very celebratory, and it wasn't. Yeah. It was very reverent. And when you look at like the early services of Easter, they're very mournful, they're very heavy, they're very dark.
Like for them, my grandmothers, that was like, why are you listening to music?
Oh yeah, no, I mean, no, it is a period of reverence. So then we have the 40 days of the Easter season, the 50 days of the Easter season, and the releasing on the other side of that, taking us into common time, is Pentecost, right? So these celebrations are happening before this long 90-day period of really fasting and praying and all of that, right? So what happens, because our cultures have gotten so secular, we tend to forget that we work on different calendars, right? We got the calendar everybody agrees with on our phone, right? But your work has a calendar, school has a calendar, everything has a calendar. The two calendars that controlled everyone's life was the religious calendar and the agricultural calendar. So we have Carnival in places where it's hot and it's getting cold. Where here, we're cold and we're getting hot. So on what end is that celebration happening? Because Lent in the northern hemisphere of this, up here, it's cold. It's snow on the ground. It's ice. You're not going anywhere. You're not going out party. No, 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 no. Right? So when we think about that, and we're controlled, the large gatherings of people where people can get out and travel and do and stuff really is both the seasonal calendars. But when we look at the structure of the celebrations that happen in the warmer climates, they tend to be before Lent, where ours then is going to be on the other end. Because in between, you're not doing that, right? You're not doing that through Lent. You're not doing that through the season of Easter. We have to get out of what we're to call the heavy religious period of, and a lot of people don't do that anymore. We forget the seasons of the Christian church holidays. We look at that day, but when you look at any of the, if you go to church, you may see the changes in the linens, right? You see them, they go white, and then they'll go red for Pentecost, and then we'll have Pentecost for a couple of weeks, and then we go green into common time, and then they'll go back to white, in the fall, so we come in and out of these colors. But a lot of people don't realize that there are rituals and fasts and feasts and rogation days and all these other days that fall into that, because we just don't carry that anymore. So that's what's coming up. Yeah, they're all very connected, and they're all coming out of that heavily Spanish, Portuguese Catholicism that is brought here, because the Pope said, when he divvied up the world and he gave Spain this half, their deal was to spread Christianity. Wherever the Pope did a bull and told them, yeah, I'll give you this side of where, their responsibility was to spread the religion. And so that's that religious calendar. And even with the Protestant Reformation, they took away like the angels and the archangels and that kind of stuff. They took away the glitz, but they maintained the same religious calendar. So that Christian calendar really plays into that. So yes, very much so.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Anyone else? Yes, ma'am.
It's just a man bought like a casket of rum, brandy or something.
Yes.
And I was wondering, in terms of the wines and food that people would have for these festivals, where did they come from? Were people bringing their own food, or were they pooling resources?
Eat all of the above, because they knew they were going and they planned for it. And they, first of all, there's a lot of food around. When you think of like, we had the references that things that they're selling, they are selling oysters. We have major oyster beds. Like, we are exporting oysters. Like, as a culinary historian, I look at some of the 17th, 18th century recipes for these pickled oysters, and they're thousands of dollars now, right? Because they were just there, and they were bigger. They're like the size of your hand. They're selling buttermilk. Buttermilk is the waste product of a milk industry. The dairying industry in New York was not cheese, it was butter. And we sent that butter to the Caribbean, West Indies, right? Your waste is the buttermilk, the sour milk. So you're going to throw it away, you're going to give it to the hogs, you're going to let them drink it, right? They sold berries, fish, things that they could get themselves, the early spring greens and things like that. But that's what we're seeing them in that selling and trading or things. But also we know that some of the women in Albany sold gingerbread. But gingerbread would have been made during that time, right? During the holidays, if you look at any of the handwritten manuscripts that we have, or receipt books, they call them receipt books, not recipe books, throughout the state, how many variations of gingerbread do you have? Waffles, pancakes, those are common things that the cooks and women who were which almost all the cooks are enslaved, that they would have had access to, and they could save up for the spice. The one thing to remember about food in New York, the Dutch are international traders. And this is a dance that I always have to watch because people want to say sugar was expensive. And not really, right? You may not be able to afford it, but does that make it expensive, right? We are so connected to the Caribbean. New York has ships leaving constantly. All the wheat that is grown in New York, where is it going? It's going to the Caribbean and West Indies. You know, we have in our head that triangle of, you know, sugar to rum to slaves. That is not New York. New York is wheat to sugar to slaves, because the wheat is being traded for sugar in the West Indies and Caribbean, then that's being sold in Europe to pick up the enslaved, right? So we did a little bit of rum, but our deal is the wheat. And so in that exchange, and the Dutch, because of the Dutch East India Company, they control the international spice market. Mm-hmm. And to this day, when you look at Northern European foods, the Dutch have more spice still in their food, and they still control the spice market because spice does not grow here. Spice grows everywhere else. So the level of spice and sugar and wheat is, you know, everybody, we got, if there is a river or a creek, there's a grist mill. That's our major export. That is New York's cash crop. So that's what they're doing. And the foods that we see them are things that they can get during that period, you know, during that weather cycle, and things that are basically free.
Lavada, I wanted to interject. Some of my ancestors were huckleberry pickers.
Yes.
In upstate New York on Lavada. One of the profiles in my upcoming book is Aunt Jane Brown, who was a woman who was a slave child, brought as a child in downtown Battery Park area. And one of the things she details is she remembers in 1790 when her loyalist enslavers said that they stopped being English that day, and what they ate and what she made for them before their last Easter dinner and the last New Year's before that. And it's an incredible story.
Yeah, so there are, you know, and strawberries are indigenous, and we got blueberries, wineberries, all of that. So yeah, that's what's showing up in the documents that they're
And they're using a lot of molasses too, and
yeah, and molasses is the byproduct of sugar. You know, the sugar is readily available, and so is maple syrup.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. Great.
Thank you so much, Lavada, for such a wonderful presentation and important history and thoughtful responses. If you enjoyed tonight's talk, please make sure to check out our social media at Dyken Farmhouse. We have a few important events coming up. Our Pinkster celebration will be May 30th, next Saturday from 11 to 3. We'll have family story time. We'll have a back porch concert, free admission, free guided tour of the museum. I feel like I'm missing something else. Dancing. Yes, thank you. A traditional West African dance workshop as well at 1 p.m. And we also have 2 more back porch history lectures, both of them exploring the US 250th in very distinct ways. One of them is more of an interactive discussion, and the other one is more so about the Dyckman family and where they went during the revolution and during wartime, and if there's anything left to uncover from that time. But thank you so much for coming today, and thank you again, Lavada. All right. Bye.
Great.
And you know, if you can get the hall the houses, ask for the curators, and they can tell you if they have the